Chapter 5. I believe she's gone, Hardy. The other ships just didn't seem to understand. At 1:25, the Olympic asked, "Are you steering south to meet us?" Phillips patiently explained, "We are putting the woman off in the boats." Then the Frankfurt, "Are there any ships around you already?" Phillips ignored this one. Again the Frankfurt, asking for more details. This was too much. He jumped up, almost screaming, "The damn fool! He says, 'What's up, old man?' Then he angrily tapped back, 'You fool, stand by and keep out.'" From time to time, Captain Smith dropped in, once to warn that the power was fading, again to say she couldn't last much longer, later to report that the water had reached the engine room. At 1:45, Phillips begged the Carpathia, "Come as quickly as possible, old man. Engine room filled up to the boilers." Meanwhile, Bride draped an overcoat over Phillips' shoulders, then managed to strap a lifebelt on him. The problem of getting him into his boots was more complicated. Phillips asked whether any boats were left. Maybe the boots wouldn't be needed. Once he turned the set over to Bride, he went out to see what was happening. He returned, shaking his head. Things look very queer. They looked queer indeed. The sea now slopped over the Titanic's forward well deck, rippled against the cranes, the hatches, the foot of the mast, washed against the base of the white superstructure. The roar of steam had died, the nerve-wracking rockets had stopped, but the slant of the deck was steeper, and there was an ugly list to port. About 1:40, Chief Officer Wilde shouted, "Everyone on the starboard side to straighten her up!" Passengers and crew trooped over, and the Titanic swung sluggishly back on an even keel. The work on the boats resumed. As number 2 prepared to cast off at 1:45, Steward Johnson, his pockets bulging with oranges, yelled up to the boat deck for a razor to cut the falls. Seaman McAuliffe dropped one down, calling, "Remember me at Southampton and give it back." McAuliffe was probably the last man on the Titanic so sure of returning to Southampton. First Officer Murdoch knew better. As he walked along the deck with Chief Steward Hardy of second class, he sighed, "I believe she's gone, Hardy." There was no longer any difficulty persuading people to leave the ship. Paul Maguet, the chef's assistant, jumped 10 feet into a dangling boat. Somebody on a lower deck tried to drag him out, but he squirmed free and was safe. Third-class passenger Daniel Buckley, safely through the broken gate and onto the boat deck, took no more chances. With several other men, he jumped onto a boat and huddled there, crying. Most of the men were hauled out, but somewhere he got a woman's shawl. He said Mrs. Astor put it over him. In any case, the disguise worked. Another young man, no more than a boy, wasn't as lucky. Fifth Officer Lowe caught him under a seat in number 14, begging that he wouldn't take up much room. Lowe drew his gun, but the boy only pleaded harder. Then Lowe changed tactics, told him to be a man, and somehow got him out. By now Mrs. Charlotte Collier and other women in the boat were sobbing, and her 8-year-old daughter Marjorie joined the uproar, tugging at Lowe's arm and crying, "Oh, Mr. Man, don't shoot! Please don't shoot the poor man!" Lowe paused long enough to smile and nod at her reassuringly. The boy was out now, anyhow, lying face down near a coil of rope. But number 14's troubles weren't over. Another wave of men rushed the boat. Seaman Scarcott beat them back with the tiller. This time Lowe pulled his gun and shouted, "If anyone else tries that, this is what he'll get." He fired 3 times along the side of the ship as the boat dropped down to the sea. Murdoch barely stopped a rush at number 15. He yelled at the crowd, "Stand back! Stand back! It's women first!" All the way forward, there was more trouble at Collapsible C, which had been fitted into the davits used by number 1. A big mob pushed and shoved, trying to climb aboard. 2 men dropped in. Purser Herbert McElroy fired twice into the air. Murdoch shouted, "Get out of this! Clear out of this!" Huell Woolner and Bjornstrom Stefansson, attracted by the pistol flashes, rushed over to help. Yanking the culprits by arms, legs, anything, they cleared the boat. The loading continued. Jack Thayer stood off to one side with Milton Long, a young shipboard acquaintance from Springfield, Massachusetts. They had met for the first time this evening over after-dinner coffee. Following the crash, Long, who was traveling alone, attached himself to the Thayer family, but he and Jack lost the older Thayers in the crowd on A deck. Now they were alone, debating what to do, supposing the rest of the family was already off in the boats. They finally decided to stay clear of Boat C. With all the uproar, it seemed bound to tip over. But they were wrong. Things gradually straightened out, and finally Boat C was ready for lowering. Chief Officer Wilde shouted to know who was in command. Hearing him, Captain Smith turned to Quartermaster Rowe, still fiddling with a Morse lamp, and told him to take charge. Rowe jumped in and got ready to lower. Close by, President Bruce Ismay stood, helping get the boat ready for lowering. He was calmer now than in those early moments when Lowe had bawled him out. In fact, he seemed every inch an accepted member of the Titanic's crew. This was a frequent role for Ismay, but by no means his only one. Sometimes he preferred the role of passenger. So far during the voyage, he shifted back and forth several times. At Queenstown, he was sort of a super captain. He told Chief Engineer Bell the speed he wanted for various stages of the voyage. He also set the New York arrival time at Wednesday morning instead of Tuesday night. He didn't consult Captain Smith on this. Later, at sea, Ismay was mostly a passenger, enjoying the fine cuisine of the a la carte restaurant, shuffleboard, bridge, tea and scones in his deck chair on the port side of A-deck. This Sunday, he was enough a member of the crew to see the ice message that arrived from another ship. In the bright, sunny palm court, just as the bugler sounded lunch, Captain Smith gave him a warning from the Baltic. During the afternoon, Ismay, who liked to remind people who he was, fished it out of his pocket and waved it at Mrs. Ryerson and Mrs. Thayer. In the smoking room before dinner, while the twilight still glowed through the amber-stained windows, Captain Smith saw it and got the message back. Then Ismay walked down to the restaurant, immaculate in his dinner jacket, very much a first-class passenger. After the crash, he went back to being in the crew. Up with the captain on the bridge, consulting with Chief Engineer Bell, and now, despite the tongue-lashing from Fifth Officer Lowe, shouting orders about the boats. Then came another switch. At the very last moment, he suddenly climbed into Boat C. Down it dropped with 42 people, including Bruce Ismay, just another passenger. Most of the passengers were different. William T. Stead, independent as ever, sat reading alone in the first-class smoking room. To Fireman Kemish passing by, he looked as though he planned to stay there, whatever happened. Reverend Robert J. Bateman of Jacksonville stood outside, watching his sister-in-law, Mrs. Ada Balls, enter a boat. "If I don't meet you again in this world," he called, "I will in the next." Then as the boat jerked down, he took off his necktie and tossed it to her, as a keepsake. George Widener and John B. Thayer leaned against the boat deck rail, quietly talking things over. Contrary to young Jack's guess, his father wasn't safe in a boat, and in fact didn't have any idea of entering one. A little way off, Archie Butt, Clarence Moore, Arthur Ryerson, and Walter Douglas stood silently together. Major Butt was very quiet, had no pistol, took no active part, despite the stories later told that he practically took charge. Further aft, J. Yates, described as a gambler hoping to make a maiden voyage killing, stood alone and friendless. To a woman entering a boat, he handed a page torn from his appointment book. Signed with one of his aliases, the note read, "If saved, inform my sister, Mrs. F. J. Adams, of Findlay, Ohio. Lost, J. H. Rogers." Benjamin Guggenheim had a more detailed message. "If anything should happen to me, tell my wife I've done my best in doing my duty." Actually, Guggenheim almost outdid himself. Gone was the sweater that Stuart Etches made him wear, also his life belt. Instead, he and his valet now stood resplendent in evening clothes. "We've dressed in our best," he explained, "and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." There were a few couples, too. The Allisons stood smiling on the promenade deck, Mrs. Allison grasping little Lorraine with one hand, her husband with the other. The Strausses leaned against the boat deck rail, their arms about each other's waists. A young Western couple waited nearby. When Lightoller asked the girl if he could put her in a boat, she told him cheerfully, "Not on your life. We started together, and if need be, we'll finish together." Archibald Gracie, Clinch Smith, a dozen other first-class men worked with the crew, loading the last boats. As they helped Miss Constance Willard of Duluth, Minnesota, they smiled and told her to be brave. She noticed great beads of sweat stood out on their foreheads. Lightoller was sweating too. He peeled off his greatcoat. Even in sweater and pajamas, he was wringing wet from the hard work. He looked so odd on this bitter cold night that Assistant Surgeon Simpson, always a wag, called out, "Hello, Lights, are you warm?" The assistant surgeon was with old Dr. O'Loughlin, Purser McElroy, and Assistant Purser Barker. Lightoller joined them for a moment. They all shook hands and said goodbye. No time for more. A glance down the emergency stairway told Lightoller the water was now on sea deck, rising fast. But the lights were still bright, the music still ragtime, the beat still lively. Only 2 more boats. One of them, number 4, had been a headache all night. Over an hour ago, Lightoller lowered it to A-deck, planning to fill it from there, but the windows were all closed. Then someone noticed the Titanic's sounding spar stuck out directly below the boat. Seaman Sam Parks and storekeeper Jack Foley went down to chop it away, but they had trouble finding an axe. Time was wasting. Lightoller hurried on to the other boats. He'd load this one later. Meanwhile, the passengers waiting to go in number 4 cooled their heels, and they were very prominent heels. The Astors, Wideners, Thayers, Carters, and Ryersons were sticking pretty much together. When Lightoller first ordered the boat loaded, wives, children, maids, and nurses went down to the promenade deck to get in as a group. When they found out they couldn't, they just stayed put. Eventually, most of the husbands turned up, and for over an hour the cream of New York and Philadelphia society just waited around while the windows were opened and the sounding spar chopped away. Once they were ordered back up to the boat deck, but then Second Steward Dodd sent them right back down again. Exasperated, Mrs. Thayer exclaimed, "Just tell us where to go and we will follow. You ordered us up here and now you're sending us back." It was 1:45 when Lightoller returned. Now he stood, one foot in number 4, the other on an open windowsill. Somebody put deck chairs against the rail to serve as steps. The men stood by to pass the women and children through the windows. John Jacob Astor helped Mrs. Astor across the frame, then asked if he could join her. She was, as he put it, in delicate condition. "No, sir," Lightoller replied. "No men are allowed in these boats until the women are loaded first." Astor asked which boat it was, and Lightoller said number 4. Colonel Gracie was sure Astor merely wanted to locate his wife later. Lightoller was sure he had planned to make a complaint. Then came the Ryersons' turn. Arthur Ryerson noticed their French-made Victorine had no lifebelt. Quickly he stripped off his own and buckled it on her. When Mrs. Ryerson led her son Jack to the window, Lightoller called out, "That boy can't go!" Mr. Ryerson indignantly stepped forward. "Of course that boy can go with his mother. He is only 13. So they let him pass, Lightoller grumbling, "No more boys." At 1:55, number 4 dropped to the sea, just 15 feet below. Mrs. Ryerson was shocked to see how far the ship had sunk. She watched the water pour in the big square ports on sea deck, sweep around the period furniture of the deluxe suites. Then she looked up at the promenade deck. Mr. Ryerson was still standing by the rail with Mr. Widener, looking down at the boat. They seemed very quiet. Only one boat left. Collapsible D had now been fitted into the davits used by number 2 and was ready for loading. There was no time to spare. The lights were beginning to glow red. Chinaware was breaking somewhere below. Jack Thayer saw a man lurch by with a full bottle of Gordon's gin. He put it to his mouth and drained it. "If I ever get out of this," Thayer said to himself, "there is one man I'll never see again." Actually, he was one of the first survivors Thayer met. Lightoller took no chances. Most of the passengers had moved aft, but still, one boat, 47 seats, 1,600 people. He had the crew lock arms in a wide ring around boat D. Only women could come through. 2 baby boys were brought by their father to the edge of the ring, handed through, and placed in the boat. The father stepped back into the crown. He called himself Mr. Hoffman and told people he was taking the boys to visit relatives in America. His name really was Navatrill, and he was kidnapping the children from his estranged wife. Henry B. Harris, the theatrical producer, escorted Mrs. Harris to the ring. Was told he couldn't go any further. He sighed, "Yes, I know. I will stay." Colonel Gracie rushed up with Mrs. John Murray Brown and Miss Edith Evans, 2 of the 5 unprotected ladies, to whom he had offered his services on the trip. He stopped by the line, but saw the women through. They reached boat D just as it was starting down the falls. Miss Evans turned to Mrs. Brown. "You go first. You have children waiting at home." Quickly she helped Mrs. Brown over the rail. Then someone yelled to lower away, and at 2:05 Collapsible D, the last boat of all, started down toward the sea, without Edith Evans. Directly below, Hugh Woolner and Bjornstrom Stefansson were standing alone by the rail. It had been a hard night, helping Mrs. Candy, trying to save the Strausses, dragging those cowards out of boat C. Now they were on A deck, trying to find someone else to help, but the deck was absolutely deserted. The lights had a reddish glow. "This is getting rather a tight corner," Woolner remarked. "Let's go through the door at the end." They walked forward to the open end of the promenade deck. As they came out, the sea poured onto the deck, over their evening pumps and up to their knees. They hopped on the railing. 9 feet away, they saw boat D sliding down the side of the ship. It was now or never. "Let's make a jump for it," cried Woolner. "There's plenty of room in her bow." Stefansson hurled himself out of the boat, landing head over heels up front. The next second, Woolner followed, falling half in, half out. In another instant, Collapsible D hit the water and cast off. As it pulled away, Seaman William Lucas called up to Miss Evans, still standing on the deck, "There's another boat going to be put down for you."